When we think about the First World War, when we hear about the First World War, of course, as we've seen here, we hear a lot about the Western Front. But as we know, the war not only encompassed large swathes of Europe, much of Europe, but of course large swathes of coastal communities in various parts of the world at different times. And if we hear about the war at sea, then what we've tended to hear, and we've heard this a lot during the commemoration period, was if we've tended to hear about dreadnoughts and Jutland, right? And that is, when you say, oh, I'm doing things on the First World War at sea, and people immediately say dreadnoughts and Jutland. And yet the war was much more complex than that. So I'm going to look at how the fishing industry got involved. And for a lot of people, this is a forgotten war. As I said, it's not a part that gets publicised to a great extent. So I'm going to look at why was the fishing industry so heavily involved in the First World War? And indeed it was. What was the nature of that involvement? And I'm going to make something of an estimate, try to make something of an estimate of what the cost was in terms of lives and ships. So let's have a look. Well, there were three main tasks that the fishing industry, and that means the fishermen and the fishing vessels, and as we'll see later on, other people on shore, had to make in terms of the war. Three main areas. One was in anti-U-boat patrols, and quite a lot of vessels were involved in that, as we'll see. Minesweeping was an absolutely crucial role of both fishing vessels and their crews as well. And then for the remainder of the fishermen who were not taken up in one way or another in Admiralty service, it was maintaining the beleaguered nation's fish supplies. All things that were absolutely crucial from one very discrete group of men. And at the beginning of the Great War, there were about 101,000 fishermen across the United Kingdom. And that includes what we now call Southern Ireland, of course. Today, there are less than 10,000 fishermen in the country. But at that time, there were 100,000 and they were in various places. The sort of leading edge of the fleet was vessels like this. This was a steam trawler. This is the Hull steam trawler Casio. It was state-of-the-art almost for this period of time. However, it's got an open bridge, as you can see. The owner of that particular fleet, the Hellier steam trawling fleet, he didn't like the idea of closed bridges. He'd had sailing vessels before. He thought this would make fishermen soft. They might doze off. So they had open bridges. Just prior to the war, many of these actually got closed in. But that was the basics. What happened? Well, during the war, nearly 3,000 vessels were taken into naval service. They were trawlers. Trawlers are vessels which, I'm not going to go in a long sort of stream business about them, but they dragged a net along the seabed and they caught whitefish, cod, haddock and the like. Drifters drifted with fleets of nets, curtains of nets, and they caught herring. The vessels were quite different. Steam trawlers were much more powerful, but steam drifters also had quite a degree of a job there. And during the war, on Admiralty service, as I said, 1,467 were requisitioned there. We see the losses as well in terms of the vessels themselves. 244 trawlers were lost on Admiralty service. As we'll see, many more were left lost whilst still fishing. And the drifters, not quite as many lost. But you can see it's roughly 3,000 vessels that were engaged, which was a pretty substantial part of the fleet. What were the total casualties? Well, it's easier to unpick these at the moment with regard to trawlers and drifters. When I say the total casualties, that's the ones lost on Admiralty service and the ones lost while continuing to fish in what was actually the maritime front line. And we see that 503, almost not far off 1 in 3 vessels were lost to the trawlers during that period of the war. Quite something. Trawlers had been around for quite a while. This is the Cook Welton Gemmell Yard at Beverley in East Yorkshire. Many people, it's 9 miles from the River Humber, but many people don't realise this was a major source. And an analysis of what was built in that yard, I've done because I've done a lot of work with Cook Welton and Gemmell people, and you can see what the vessels were used for when they were taken into service. There's quite a lot of these were taken for minesweepers. They built them at 2 places at the time. You can see just literally how many vessels were taken. You can see some were used for boom defence and some armed fishing trawlers. That's what I'll come to later on. Later in the war, even the civilian vessels, some of them were armed to take part in the war as we move forward. Now, why did fishermen play a major part in this war? In the sense in the past, fishermen had regularly been a target for the press gangs for taking into service. But of course, by the 20th century, we had a professional navy. Why on earth did fishermen, as a unit, come to play such an important role? Well, perhaps part of it, you know, was a reaction to what was actually taking place. Because, as I say, the war becoming so much more professional, we'd got the development of huge vessels, and this is HMS Dreadnought. Dreadnought, built in 1906, was everything in the sort of state of modern industrial power. It was steel, armour-plated, steam turbines, huge big guns. It was said to render every other battleship in the world redundant. That was the general idea. And of course, the British built up a big fleet, but the Germans also were to build up a large, what they call the high seas fleet. We had the Grand Fleet, and that played a major part. And these battleships were enormous, as I said, part of the industrial complex of the modern age. And for some people, this envisaged that there might be a future war, a sort of any future war between these two, or battle between these two sides, would be sort of like a new Trafalgar, a sort of armour-plated Armageddon, where both sides would attack each other and one side would defeat the other in terms of that. I mean, that was one particular perspective of it. But the war was much more complex, or the world had become much more complex by the time of the Great War. And just want to pick 3 vessels that were built in 1906 that emerged. We got the building of that first dreadnought. This was also the time when the first U-boat, the first German submarine, was constructed, U-1. Same time, by the way, one of these little trawlers, the steam trawler Viola. Still see that, still around. It lies at Grytviken in South Georgia at the moment, down there. These were 3 vessels that emerged in that year. Now, which one of them was involved in sinking the most enemy vessels? It was the one down there. Dreadnought was involved in sinking 1 U-boat. Viola had many, many attacks on German U-boats and was actively involved in the sinking of 2 of those vessels. U-1 never sank anything in the case of the war. Why did that happen? What was the reasons? How come these fishermen who we see around, and this is a great picture from 1910, how did these fishermen come to play such a direct role in the activities around the coast with their fishing vessels? And rather rough and ready crews, anything quite different in many respects to what you think about in terms of fishermen at the time, in terms of naval forces at the time. These people, and often their animals, went off to war in 1914. Well, think about what had happened. The war wasn't, also the technology at sea wasn't just about dreadnoughts and this envisaging this great battle, or trying to avoid this great battle, but the technology of war was changing subtly in other ways. We got the development, of course, in this period, or the coming of the mine and the torpedo. The mine was not new, it had been around for a long time, but it had been enhanced and developed in the later 19th century, as indeed had the torpedo. And these were, in many respects, quite likely to change the nature of things, you know, as they went along. And I don't think anybody, when the war opened, appreciated just how the impact that the submarine, that the U-boat would have during the case of the war. But we have to go back a bit further than that to look at why fishermen became very quickly actively involved during the war. I need to go back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-6. And this, of course, was a bitter war between Russia and Japan. The fishermen had unwittingly become involved in this when one of the Hull trawler fleets had been bombarded in the North Sea by the Russian fleet that was sailing from the Baltic round to reinforce its people in the Far East, and came across the trawler fleet in the North Sea and thought it was the Japanese torpedo fleets and attacked it. We're not going to that story now. What really comes out of it for us was the fact of the impact for both sides of the sea mine. The sea mine was very important because it proved in this battle, this war, that lots of vessels could be lost. 3 battleships were sunk, 5 cruisers and 3 destroyers. Thousands of sailors were lost. It was immediately realised that the sea mine would play a major role in the future. There were attempts to get the technology banned. These came to nothing. The problem everybody on every side was, how on earth do you deal with these mines? How do you clear them? Well, one of the strategies that was put forward and proved to be successful was that steam trawlers in particular could be used using a modified gear based very, very loosely on the idea of trawling, of sweeping mines from the sea. And in 1908, initial trials took place. It was actually a fisherman from, a fishing vessel owner from Grimsby who'd suggested the idea initially to the Admiralty that they actually try this method. And there were initial trials that proved successful. In 1909, the Admiralty acquired 4 trawlers, and in 1910-11 they created the Royal Naval Reserve Trawler Section, which was a minesweeping reserve, and they envisaged having 100 vessels on standby to be taken up with 1,000 fishermen of all ranks. They exceeded those figures by the time the war came round. They did trained crews in 1911 for minesweeping. They started these trials in Aberdeen. Officers from the retired list were brought in to command the units of 6 minesweepers. And mobilisation officers were identified for each port to get this underway should it become necessary. And by 1914, they'd actually sort of taken up 146 trawlers, agreed with the owners that these would come into service by this agreement. And recruitment began very quickly, but it was as soon as the war started, on the first day that the British were involved, there was a mine-laying incident where the Germans sailed across the North Sea and strew a load of mines. It was evident straight away. So fishing vessels were quickly taken up, many of which hadn't been trained for these purposes. Other vessels were brought in, and quite quickly the less powerful drifters were brought in for the work as well. So quite quickly a large number of vessels were taken up. And by September 1914, more than 250 fishing vessels had been taken into Admiralty service along with their crews. There was also the creation of what became known as the auxiliary patrol. Some of these fishing vessels, now that the U-boats had been spotted as a really a force to be reckoned with, were brought together to counter the U-boat threat. And they were organised in armed units, which consisted of a yacht, again requisitioned, and 4 trawlers, and later on in the war, as they became available, 4 motorboats as well. And by the end of October, 137 of these patrol vessels, these were not minesweeping, they were being used for patrol vessels, were taken in commission, and 246 minesweeping trawlers were already taken up. There were 21 operational units dotted around the British coast to counter the U-boat and the submarine attack. So the Admiralty kept on building these numbers. 750 vessels were taken up quite quickly. Other vessels were taken into the auxiliary patrol area. Quite a lot of incidents were quite soon occurring, and there were attacks on vessels that were left fishing during the case of the war. But one of the most dramatic incidents to take place took place quite quickly, and that was really drawn up by the idea that that we needed to keep all the fishermen that we could fishing, if we weren't using them, or use them quite effectively to carry out the minesweeping and the anti-patrol duties. When the war first started, there was a call for arms, and it was patriotic call. Fishermen joined many army regiments. Many of these people were lost to the war at sea for the duration of the war. The Germans had the same problem. The Germans seemed to be able to unpick this and get many of their people back fishing or back on their minesweeping duties. The British found this a lot more difficult to do for various reasons. So lots of fishermen were lost quite quickly to the war service. But quite quickly after that, it was realised that because of the actions that were taking place around the country and off our coasts, that we needed yet more of these vessels to counter what was happening. As I said, the U-boat had been, I think, underestimated by both sides at the beginning of the war. Commander Hershing of the U-21 had made history by sinking the first U-boat, by sinking the first warship with the U-boat when he'd sunk Pathfinder off St. Abb's Head in the summer of 1914, and quite quickly afterwards, in September, 3 admittedly elderly battle cruisers, the Aboukir, Cressy and Hogue, were sent to the bottom by 1 U-boat. Now this was, okay, these were old vessels, they were crewed by reservists, but the implication was there. We had spent a lot of money on huge dreadnought vessels, and these large vessels were seemingly or possibly vulnerable to these new weapons. And like I said, it was quite a dramatic eye-opener. Not more so than when a month or so later, HMS Audacious, one of the new super dreadnoughts just come into service, was mined off the coast of Northern Ireland while preparing to target practice, and was sunk and lost. That was kept pretty quiet on our side of the Atlantic for a period, but of course it got out Americans in various other newspapers as well. So trawlers and fishermen and drifters and their fishermen were taken up for service quite quickly. Some were used to guard the entrances to places like Scapa Flow, to put booms across, because of course the Grand Fleet at the beginning of the war had moved up to Scapa Flow. Ideal anchorage, but not very well protected. So vessels were taken up for that. But gradually it got worse. HMS Formidable was sunk, which was a pre-dreadnought, sunk off Start Point in Devon in January 1915. The idea Churchill had on the back of that was to lay anti-submarine nets, which the drifters would be used to guard. These nets were laid in areas where it was hoped you would catch dreadnoughts. Sorry, you would catch U-boats. But again, as U-boats were coming along and as surface craft were coming along and laying mines, there was a need to keep various routes around the country open. Dover became a very serious place for actions as we tried to keep the sea lanes open. The Germans often attacked. The minesweeping trawlers were often on the front line. And we can see lots of actions during the course of the war. Boom defences being laid in all sorts of different positions. Here we see anti-submarine nets being laid from a drifter as the work is being overseen. We can see them going over the side. The vessels in the war at first were very poorly armed. U-boats were under there. How on earth did you deal with them? Some vessels were, all the anti-patrol vessels were all armed with, say, 3-pounder, they were very lucky, 6-pounder guns at the beginning of the war. Many of the minesweeping vessels were not armed properly until later in the war. There were 2 or 3 ways of dealing with U-boats on the bottom, first of all. You had your gun, if there was a vessel on the surface, but what did you do underneath? Well, you might tow what was called an explosive sweep, which was a cable with explosives on the end, which was linked to by electrical supply to the vessel itself. If it came into contact with something, you fired it. And that was the early way you could deal with them. The other way was to throw one of these things. Well, ironically, 2 U-boats were sunk involved in these in the course of the war. They got caught in nets and were dealt with in that way. But as you can see, it was pretty poor. The sort of equipment they had to deal with this threat was quite something. And so the vessels were sent everywhere. And in the early stages of the war, they were quite hopelessly outmatched in terms of the anti-submarine work. As we'll see, the minesweeping went quite well. But first of all, in the early stages, they were quite overwhelmed because if a U-boat came to the surface, it was far faster than a trawler and could run away from it. It was more heavily gunned, armed than a trawler during the case of the war. But that was how it went, and drifters and trawlers were all armed. But though these vessels were out there day after day, week after week, month after month throughout the war, and involved in some quite vigorous activities, they got very little publicity. If you look at many of much of the papers that came out at the time, the journals, the media, this is from the Illustrated War News, Grand Fleet on patrol. This was what we were shown, these vessels, battle cruisers and battleships, making heavy weather of it. You got very little about the work that they were doing day after day. And yet the Germans were coming in and laying these minefields. These are some of the early minefields that the Germans laid. And when they laid these early minefields, we had to deal with them. Yes, we had sweeps. All the crews who had been trained previously had been trained to remove mines. Not one of them had ever moved a live mine before the war started. And many of the new vessels that came on board hadn't had even the rudiments of training. When they went in to clear these fields, there was a lot of loss of vessels and crews. And it was also realised quite quickly, huge minefields laid, it would be impossible to completely clear these. So the idea came about was instead of completely trying to clear the minefield, and in fact, it might not be a good idea to clear the entire minefield, because part of it might actually be useful to deter further attacks by the U-boats themselves, because these mines moved. So the idea was to clear a path through the minefields and keep this regularly cleared. And what were developed from the very early stages of the war were what known as the East Coast war channels. Now, if you look at these were channels that were continually swept. At daylight, whenever the weather was suitable, they were swept day after day, week after week, month after month, all the way through the war. And in actual fact, if you look today, if we were able to drain the North Sea today, what we'd actually see was a continuation of the Western Front, from Flanders all the way up the coast of Britain, that's littered with the remains of U-boats, remains of merchant ships, the remains of armed trawlers and drifters, etc., all the way along there. And that was the main thing for much of the 4 years of the war, which was to keep that area clear and cleaned. It was called the swept channels. This is just a look at a bit of it. The channel itself was buoyed, so you knew where it was. The vessels had to go through it. It would be swept early in the morning, hopefully, or start sweeping, and then cleared. And when we look at it, we can see where the buoys themselves are laid. This is a piece from the hydrographical maps of the time that actually show the number of losses along the coast. It gives you some idea of the conflict and how close it was to the coast. Because, of course, we swept it, and that was the place, of course, where the Germans headed. Because as the war progressed, the means of laying mines changed. The beginning of the war, how we laid mines was with vessels that came in, dropped the mines over the side and made a run for it. By June 1915, the Germans had developed and introduced mine-laying U-boats. These were U-boats that crossed the sea, deposited a catch of U-boats, 14, 15 at first, of mines, 14, 15 at first, and then later many more, and then sailed back across to their bases. And their bases, for some of them, were, of course, in Belgium. you know, the concepts of how did a minesweeping work in the war. Well, the mine was laid, get the idea down there. Two vessels would come along and would lay what was called a sweep wire between them. These wires would cut the cable, the mines would come to the surface, and the mine would be sunk either by gunfire, usually which made the thing leak and it sank to the bottom, or by making it explode. So it looks pretty straightforward, pretty easy sort of stuff, but of course you forget to do that you had to actually enter the minefield themselves. And this was an incredibly dangerous job. And it's estimated that one minesweeper was lost every other week of the war. And on average, every time a minesweeper was lost, half the crew were lost with it. The fishermen themselves not only manned the trawlers, and later some drifters were brought in to do this role as well, but also manned many other suitable vessels as well. You can see different formations that were used in different ways. This often went wrong, as you can see. Here, for example, is a good example of a mine being taffled with the gear. When the gear was hauled back on board, they found they had a mine on the side. Luckily, the horns, which would cause it to explode, were kept clear. This chap's having his photograph taken with it. The other thing was, of course, the Admiralty before the war hadn't spent a lot of money on developing effective sea mines. People who'd spent the money and developed very good mines before the war were the Russians and the Germans. We wanted to, one of the orders that went out quite early on in the war was we needed to get hold of some German mines intact. This is an example of one of the trawlers that had been sent out to get a mine and bring it back in. It was brought back into East Anglia, to Yarmouth. And that's the scene. The person who did this said it was a bit surprising when we came into the harbour with the mine swinging loose. Everybody wanted us to move out of the way. As you can see, that's another example. And they're taking the detonator out. When a trawler was hit, the damage was pretty badly. This is a minesweeping trawler that, on entering a minefield, and of course you had to get into minesweep, had been hit. And if you look at it, the entire forward section's missing. And that really increased the carnage, because traditionally on a trawler at that time, the crew's quarters were in the forecastle. And of course that was the one place that disappeared. You can see the damage that took place there. So I said the Germans began mine laying, and that allowed them to go all around the coast of Britain, the places they couldn't get to with surface mine laying vessels. And in the following years, mines were laid entirely around the coast. That gives you some idea of where the mines themselves were taken. In order to be able to counter this, we deployed all sorts of other vessels. Gradually, we were able to arm many of the minesweepers as well, like the patrol vessels. And as the war went on, vessels went from 3-pounders to 6-pounders and some to 12-pounders. I mentioned the Viola earlier on. That started off with a 3-pounder gun. Later, it had a 6-pounder gun. Later, it had a 12-pounder gun. That was the way that they went on. And that's a drifter showing the idea. The Germans always threatened this unrelenting war, restricted war on commerce. And of course, they were quite effective in the early stages of dealing with this. And of course, from 1917, they introduced the unrestricted submarine warfare. The gamble basically was, as many people in this room will know, is that the Americans, the unrestricted warfare, because of earlier attempts of this and the loss of the Lusitania, it was very unpopular on the American side of the Atlantic, and it was likely to bring the Americans in on all their resources as well. The German High Command gambled that they could bring Britain to its knees by closing its arteries of trade and exchange before the Americans had a chance to deal with that. In actual fact, of course, it failed, but in the course of it, a lot of more vessels were lost themselves in terms of that. And just to give you an idea, you can see how that works. This is the tonnage of merchant vessels lost each month of the war. The idea was, of course, was to sink far more vessels than could be replaced. And what we see here is the great peak. But then, of course, in 1970, but it drops away. And it drops away because we become, in many respects, much more effective in terms of our tactics and equipment that we're deploying than we had been before. And the German tactic failed itself. Now, you know, that's the sort of damage that a torpedo will inflict on a vessel. This one had got back into dock. But of course, not only was it a matter of hitting the commercial vessels, they also, throughout the war, wanted to hit our food supply and the remaining food supply that was brought in by fishermen themselves. Fish was seen as a strategic resource. And from the summer of, from the sort of March time 1915, they began attacking fishing vessels in earnest and sinking them out at sea. Not using a torpedo, it's a waste of time on a trawling vessel that it was seen as. Usually what they were doing was coming up alongside a vessel and opening fire on it, warning the crew to get out in their rowing boats and disappear, and then going on board, either sinking it with gunfire or going on board and putting an explosive charge. And this is a great picture, I think, from Scarborough fishermen in 1916, and it's a German photograph, and it's taken of the crew of the Scarborough trawler being lined up on the deck while their vessel's been sunk. Typically how it happened, as I say, the U-boat would surface, fire a shot in front of the unarmed fishing vessel, order the crew to get in their rowing boat, row across to the U-boat, line up on the deck, and then the Germans would use the rowing boat to go back to lay the explosive charges on the trawler. They would return, and in general cases, there's a degree of chivalry there. They were allowed to get into their rowing boat and row off. Right? You might be in the middle of the North Sea. Most of these people actually, though, did get back. And one chap I knew told us to tell about how he was the skipper of a vessel, and the Germans had come up alongside, and he'd got his rowing boat, and they'd blown up his ship. And as he's about to sail off, he'd say, "Oh, by the way, skipper," he said, "you see, we've put you had your food from the galley down below. We've put it all in the boat for you, and here's some German war bread. You'll find it nothing like as good as yours." But that was the reaction in terms of that one. So a lot of fishermen, lot of vessels lost. Some fishermen were captured and taken off, but generally many fishermen found themselves at sea in the rowing boats, and a lot of vessels were lost. This the Hellier, which was one of the biggest hull fleets, they lost lots of vessels. This is just 3 that went down in a very short period of time. Just to give you some idea about that war at sea, as I said, it's a battle front that you forget about. We've got some great records which show what happened week by week, and maps taken. This is from the Yorkshire coast at 1 week, 13th of September 1917, and it shows the different types of activity that have been noted and taking place off the coast. Some of them encounters with U-boats where there were shellings, some of them sinking, some of them just chases or whatever. It gives you some idea of the way that this war was fought. We used Q-ships, and I'm not going to go into talk about that today. That's a completely fascinating and in some ways different subject, but sometimes fishing vessels had been used as Q-ships. But sometimes the Germans disguised their U-boats to get close to the fishing vessels. And this is an example of a drawing that was taken where the vessels had been rigged, a U-boat had been rigged to look like a fishing vessel from a distance, to give you some idea. Some fishermen, particularly on the early stages of the war, had been captured by large German surface vessels, taken off to concentration camps and spent the war in Germany. That's when the dog had gone off to war and come back again. This is a propaganda picture of the Ruhleben camp from 1917. There had been some issues. This is a group of Scottish fishermen who were held in the area there. Just the idea was just to say that they're being kept reasonably well. Battles took place all around the British coast. This is Devon. This shows something of the losses of many of the older trawling fleets. They still had a lot of sailing trawlers in the southwest, and it gives you some idea of the sort of losses in that period of time. And just for the losses of vessels that are still fishing, these figures give you some idea of the sort of sheer losses. The green marks are for the ones lost by mine, the red by the U-boat. And you can see just literally that the U-boat and that idea of coming up and sinking the vessel is by far the most effective way during the war for this to happen. Where did this destruction take place of the working fishing vessels? All around the coasts of the British Isles, but particularly in the North Sea. And you get some idea of the sort of scale of that from those pictures there. But as the war progressed, we got more effective at attacking or dealing with the U-boat menace. We got the development, for example, of the hydrophone, an electronic listening device. And I've read a lot in the sort of Royal Naval books about how this is very limited effect. But when I've read through the different accounts and diaries of the various encounters, these vessels this is quite effective in some ways about locating where the U-boat itself is. The thing about it was, to make the hydrophone work effectively in those days, those early ones, you had to stop the vessel and you had to listen. Now that left the vessel in a very vulnerable position. And quite soon afterwards, the German U-boats got hydrophones as well. So you got some very deadly cases of cat and mouse activities around the coast itself. But this is an example of one of these early hydrophones, and many of these early trawlers and drifters were fitted with them during the course of the war. Viola, which I've mentioned on several occasions, gets a hydrophone from 1917. The crews are trained and they're used in various ways to locate where they are. There's a hydrophone being put over the side on one of these vessels. And the other great inception that comes in from 1916, really, is the development of the depth charge. And initially, the first year or 18 months, nearly 2 years of the war, these are used very sparingly. A vessel might be lucky, a trawler, if it's got 3 or 4 on board. But of course, by 1918, got a large number of these vessels with a large number of depth charges. And in combination with the hydrophones in the last year of the war, were used to quite great effect. So these working trawlers, these Admiralty trawlers, were some of the first vessels to use that. The Admiralty also started building its own Admiralty class trawlers, several different classes of these, which could be converted back into trawlers after the war. This is, they were built to a standard design. This is one of the ones that were built. That's another one, to give you the idea. You can see this is another one that's been turned out as well. So these vessels were designed to go off, be used in the war, and then sold off for commercial activities after the war itself. So you've got the development of hydrophones, and you've got the development of the use of the depth charge and bigger armament on board. And crews, by the time of 1917-18, are really getting expert in terms of dealing with the war at sea. The other great introduction, and the trawlers play a major part in this, was the introduction of convoys. The Admiralty steadfastly resisted the introduction of convoys through to 1917. In 1917, these start to get used in quite large numbers. And suddenly, for a U-boat captain, the sea seems to be empty of vessels because they're all in these patrols. And they have to come and attack them. And when they come, these typically have got some destroyers around them that have also got on board depth charges as well, and quite a number of these armed trawlers. And of course, they immediately, when they attack, become subject to attacks themselves. This really, as I said, after being rejected for a long period of the war, is very effective in terms of doing this. U-boats, of course, become less effective as the war goes on. That looks like a lovely propaganda picture, very large, plenty of space inside, anything but, of course, if you've been on one of these vessels, you'll see there's an attack on one of the U-boats, and there were a lot more U-boats sunk in the last 18 months or so, last year particularly of the war, than earlier on, and a lot of these were sunk had involved the use of armed fishing vessels in terms of the sinking as well. This is a particularly curious one. This involves the Viola itself. This involved the use of an airship. which had spotted the U-boat lying in wait for a convoy. Some destroyers and armed trawlers went up and depth charged the vessel. This was in the summer of 1918, and we can see the action itself that was taken. A bit of a combined operation, really, when you look at the way it works. This is one of the bizarre parts of the story, and we've heard a bit about intelligence today, was that many of these vessels that were sunk, and if you see them today, this one is the UB30, sunk off the coast of Whitby, good few miles off Whitby, in 1918. And it was rediscovered, the wreck on the bottom, in the 1990s by the Scarborough Sub-Aqua Club. And when they dived it, one of the things you can see is the hatch is off. And when you read up on it, the Viola had been involved in the sinking of it. When you read up on it, you find out that the hatch, that the sinking had been confirmed by Admiralty diver. And you think, why would the Admiralty bother sending a diver to look at that vessel itself, given the gear? And the reason was, of course, I'm not going to go into the story in great depth now, but they'd done this early on in the war. They'd found an early mine lane U-boat that had been blown up, sent a diver down to have a look at it, because they want to see about these mine lane U-boats and how they worked. He found a big hole in the side, got in, and he got the code box. And after that, they equipped him with a lorry and a team, and wherever a U-boat was reported to have been sunk in water that was diveable, they would send him, and he would go down, get inside the U-boat in his gear, and remove the codes. And that was a pretty bizarre job, because going down and getting in, the first thing he says you had to do was get the bodies out the road of the dead people. And can you imagine, it's pretty claustrophobic in the U-boat. As I always said, the submarine at the best of the time, but he would climb in and get the codes and get them out. Quite naturally, they kept that very quiet, but it was a useful piece of work. Trawlers were used for everything. They were all over on every theatre of war, in the Mediterranean, the White Sea, all over the place. These are two vessels that helping a bigger vessel that's been injured back into port. Sometimes they were involved in the recovery of airships that landed in the sea, various places. Working fishermen, if they found a torpedo at sea, they got a fiver if they brought it ashore. And you can see this is a working one out of Yarmouth that's found a torpedo and it's been brought back in. Now, the thing about this was these fishermen were taken up into Royal Naval Service quite quickly, and from all sorts of different sort of traditions. Some were inshore fishermen, some were trawlermen, but all of them were not used to naval admiralty discipline. Right? And there was a world of difference between sort of Dartmouth and Osborne trained officers and working fishermen. Right? And this was evident when you read any reports of this throughout the war. This is so evident. They didn't take to drilling well, they didn't take to being organised very well, and it comes out in all sorts of subtle ways. For example, if you're in the Royal Navy, you have to have a full set or be clean shaven. You look how many fishermen have got moustaches, right? The other thing is, when you see these photographs of the regular stuff, the cap badge is never in the middle. It's always that bit off to the one side, just enough to drive the officer to distraction. You know, when you think, it was always like that. And the other thing was that if you went on leave, as a trawlerman, you'd normally stay with the vessel, you'd go home, and you say, well, I'm not going back I'm not going to sign on for this trip, I'll have a few trips off. That didn't work well with the Admiralty, you know, for all sorts of different reasons. These are, again, look, if you look at the traditional picture you see of a group of sort of Royal Naval sailors, they don't look like that. You know what I mean? And in the end, it was found that the best way to deal with them was to hands off and let them get on with it largely. And as the war went on, many of the top trawler skippers went through to become chief skippers and did many of the jobs in the later stages of the war that had previously been done by naval officers. This is the drifter crew. Again, look at them. You know, you get that impression all the way through and all the way. And I'm very lucky in that my grandfather was one of these fishermen, right? And he spent, during the First World War, he was stationed on various trawlers as a minesweeper, and then later on the Bournemouth Belle, which became HMS Bourne during the war. And this is his vessel coming alongside the St. Cyril when they were minesweeping off the East Anglian coast. That's my grandfather again. Badge slightly to one side, moustache, you get the idea. And not only that, but I was very lucky that he left his diary, right? And I still have his diary for a period of time. 101 days were spent mainly sweeping, at sea, mainly sweeping. 71 days moored, coaling, watering, on standby. You couldn't, when the weather was too bad, or the tide was low, or the visibility was not possible, you couldn't do it. He got 10 days leave in that period of time, and the ship was involved in destroying at least 66 mines. Any one of those mines could have sunk the vessel. And he didn't have an unblemished war record, right? Early on, he'd done a big space at sea. He came home and he decided not to go back straight away. He wanted a few extra days at home. And I always remember my grandmother told me about it later on. Knock on the door, the police there. Does Mr. Robinson live here? Reply, these communities were very close together. No, he only lodges here. He lives in Manchester Street Club, which was round the corner, right? You know, yeah. But you know, so you got to think. But that war, and he writes at one stage, you know, his best friend was the skipper of another vessel, has been blown up the day before. You know, he said, you know, you never know when your time's coming. After the war, many of these fishermen had another job to do, which kept them busy, because there was the mine clearance service. All the mines that had been laid had to be cleared, and that took until about June 1920. Anybody who was in the service at that point got one of those badges. War took place in all sorts of places vessels were involved in. Joseph Watt, Peterhead fisherman, got the VC. He was involved in manning the Otranto barrage. They were attacked by an Austrian warship and told to surrender, and he attacked the Austrian warship in his drifter with a 3-pounder gun. Again, that's just he got this conspicuous gallantry for it. This is Lancashire Fusiliers on a trawler. There's a trawler beneath that at Cape Hells, Gallipoli. The trawlers, of course, had been first used earlier on to try to sweep the approaches through the Dardanelles. This is just a view of one of the hull trawlers on the bottom. There was a large loss of life amongst the trawlermen during the war, but it's not as obvious as it would be with, say, the army, you know, where you've got great fields. These people were lost around the coasts. Some were lost and have no grave but the sea, others drifted ashore, and in many different places you'll find groups of the war graves. These are some I took in Shetland at Lerwick. You can see them there. There's different stories associated with them, but all around the coast you'll see war graves in many of the villages and places to the fishermen themselves who lost themselves at sea. I'll just pass this because I know we're short on time. I just want to feature one last bit before I do. There was another aspect of the fish as a strategic resource during the war, and that was to deprive the Germans of fish, not only by shooting their trawlers, but also by going to neutral countries, such as Norway, etc. And quite a number of fish salesmen were recruited to go off to places like Norway and outbid the Germans for the fish, which we could not necessarily get back to Britain, but we disposed of. And when the Norwegians wouldn't always go along with that, we threatened them by not supplying them with supplies of coal or netting and gear as well. But large quantities of fish were actually taken, but we actually the figures held up pretty well. We motorised a lot of the inshore vessels. This is when motorisation comes in. The other vessels increasingly trawled, which was a very efficient way, not necessarily always a conservationally good way of catching fish. And we managed to reduce all sorts of different things. The Germans were much less successful than this. We kept our fleet up. This is just some figures at 3 of the German fishing ports, and you can see the way that their capture fish drops catastrophically in this period of time, and they can't make this up with imports from places like Denmark, from Norway and Sweden, because we're out buying them in the market themselves in terms of that one there. This is the fishing vessels lost in Admiralty service. You've got some idea of them from here, quite large numbers. You can see quite a number are lost in collision. And the collision is because you're working together for when you're minesweeping in tandem. And that really was quite a difficult thing in many cases of water, but it gives you some idea. Cost of men and lives is really difficult to work out because a lot of people ended up in the Royal Naval Reserve proper eventually, and they're not differentiated as fishermen. These are just ones that we know. And these 416 were lost whilst fishing, but even from that. Fishermen continued to be used in both World Wars and, of course, indeed in the Falklands War. The vessels were taken up and were used. This is the second in the Falklands War. But overall, it's a story that's largely not recorded. Most skippers were not particularly eloquent men. Many of people who wrote about the Royal Navy in the First World War, of course, were from the pucker mainstream Royal Navy. These people were from elsewhere. The last survivors, well, of course, we know Harry Allingham, and of course, he had started on a trawler. And of course, we've got the Viola, which is still around to this day. That's a few pictures of it at Beacon in South Georgia. We've been trying to get it back, not particularly successfully at the moment, but it does feature on the stamps of South Georgia, and you can see it on its minesweeping duties and various other activities. That's a picture with the engagement it was involved in. So I've got a couple of books out, of plug-in at the end. Viola, which is about the vessel itself, and then more recently in the paperback, Fishermen, the Fishing Industry and the Great War at Sea. I've got a few flyers if anybody wants one, but not very many. Thank you very much for your time.